This is Hugh Osborne of Knowledge Network Solutions with some thoughts on innovation, education, and economics. Our story begins with a graph. This blue line is U.S. industrial productivity over the last 30 years or so. You can see that it increases 80%, the fastest increase in American history, primarily due to innovation from technology. But the red line shows U.S. education productivity has dropped nearly 50%. Productivity here is defined as effectiveness measured by NAEP or SAT scores times efficiency, which is the relative cost of schooling. You can see that there is a huge gap between our schools and the rest of our economy. This is the innovation gap. The 30 years on this graph is the reform era, kicked off by A Nation at Risk in 1983. During this period, our school's innovation has been negative. That's not a lot of reform. But the real problem illustrated by this graph is that the output of the red line, our high school and college graduates, is the input to the economy shown in the blue line. As the innovation gap widens at a certain point, it creates a serious crisis. We are now in that crisis. The skill level of the American workforce is at the heart of the crisis. As the New York Times points out, the skills of American labor have been slipping compared to countries we compete with, and we have fallen dangerously behind. There are millions of unfilled jobs, while we have millions of young people out of work. This is the result of the innovation gap. The innovation gap has led to several achievement gaps which global consultant McKinsey estimates cost the U.S. economy an astonishing $3 trillion a year in GDP. That means if our schools were significantly better, our $15 trillion economy would be 20% larger. That $3 trillion is 5 times the entire spend on K-12 public education and is more than all the recessions since 1970 have hurt the U.S. economy, and that includes the Great Recession starting in 2008. The tax revenue from this $3 trillion at 25% would be $750 billion a year, enough to close the national deficit and dramatically change American politics and economics for the better. The good news here is that if we find a reliable 21st century transformation method, we should be able to pull forward some of these future tax revenues to fund widespread transformation. Now we get to the heart of the matter. The most important skills missing in our graduates are not the cognitive skills, often referred to as the 3 R's, but non-cognitive skills, especially the 21st century skills of creativity, collaboration, communications, and critical thinking. These 4 are called the 4 C's, and they have been very well defined and publicized by the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, or P21.org. The survey shown here from P21 and the American Management Association shows that these skills are assessed in recruits 60 to 80% of the time by hiring organizations. However, the 4 C's are not widely taught in our schools, which is one of the main causes of the innovation gap. Not only are 21st century skills, or the 4 C's, a requirement in 21st century workplaces, they are also deeply wired into us and are how our students learn best. This is vividly shown in Sugata Mitra's Child-Driven Education, the TED Talk of the Year from 2013. Mitra shows how children from ghettos around the world learn without teachers rapidly from computer screens placed at child-friendly positions in public places. Mitra is not trying to show that we don't need teachers, but demonstrating how kids learn most naturally. Now we can see the absolutely vital importance of non-cognitive skills. Not only are they a primary destination or goal for our school system so that our graduates can find a place in the 21st century economy, they are also the fuel to get us there, as Mitra shows. But you can't teach non-cognitive skills in traditional education environments, so our schools need to transform to authentic classroom environments that utilize the broad spectrum of human behaviors, emotions, skills, and attitudes. If they haven't done this, our schools are not using the most potent fuel to drive learning. But there's another factor as important as non-cognitive skills. Here you see the fall off in student engagement from kindergarten through 12th grade. 95% of kindergartners self-identify as loving school, but by the 12th grade, only 31 or 32% do. This graph represents a study that did not take into account the 30% dropout rate by 12th grade, so the graph really should drop from 95% to about 30% during the years from kindergarten to graduation from high school. This lack of engagement is another important dimension in our school crisis and a major cause of the innovation gap. In another study, McKinsey determined that 40 to 60% of American high school students are chronically disengaged. This disengagement or alienation is a big factor in the lack of employability of our graduates. What impact does 21st century schooling have in the classroom? We can find out by looking at Bright Idea, a project at Duke University that converts teachers from traditional methods to 21st century methods. This is done by retraining all teachers to teach all students as if they are gifted. Non-cognitive skills are both taught and measured. The outcomes from this project are phenomenal. 29% of students from at-risk populations tested as gifted versus about 1% previously. The top cohort had 47% of its students identified as gifted, which means that almost half of these students who are in the bottom 20% of American schools were lifted to the top 10%, an astonishing result. Just as important, students learn to self-regulate and take responsibility for their own learning and success. They become self-motivated, self-organized, and self-disciplined, and often help their teachers run the classroom and create curriculum. In fact, Duke found that it's easier for teachers to teach students more in the 21st century classroom than it is to teach them less in the traditional classroom. Here we see the results from one school, Lincoln Elementary, that applied the Duke method with high fidelity. The purple line is 5th grade reading, math, and science proficiency. Over 5 years, the school went from 41% proficient to 87% during a time when the demographics declined from 70% free lunch to 90% and 50% non-white to 65%. This shows the incredible power of 21st century teaching and learning. Now we can list our 21st century education goals. The traditional cognitive skills and knowledge, often referred to as the 3 R's, are of course essential. However, we add non-cognitive skills and passion, which is engagement plus initiative, as equal goals. This tripartite goal structure completely changes the game in education. And if we had these 3 goals a couple of decades ago, we could have avoided the cognitive skills only testing regimen that has done little to improve our schools and a lot to disempower teachers. How do we reach these goals as the Duke Project did? That's a subject for another time. But we can take away several important points about 21st century schooling. We've seen how central these new methods are to school success and what the 3 21st century goals are. But in addition, it's important to understand that 21st century schooling is not just a buzzword, as so many people seem to think. That it's not just 20th century schooling plus technology, a misconception that has led many a district astray. That it leads to student-powered classrooms and innovative teacher-powered schools because it improves teaching, making it easier, more fun, more rigorous as testing culture goes away. Finally, 21st century transformation will more than pay for itself. If it takes 6% more to transform our schools, or $600 per year per student, this $30 billion could easily pay off 100-fold with a $3 trillion increase in GDP. Thus, transforming to 21st century schooling could be a $3 trillion solution. Clearly, transformation to a 21st century schooling model is an absolute imperative for America.